Hello. Welcome to our third session of Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond, Expanding the Conversation. It's my pleasure to welcome you all. For this series, we've taken basically the work that was done at a JTS convening that took place at the end of October, in which we explored the kind of ways in which Zionist thinking and North American Zionism are intertwined. And then today we're actually doing something, whereas most of the sessions have had a direct corollary to what we've done at what we did at the convening. Today, I feel like this is like the point on the podcast when they're like, you get an extra. This is something that we didn't do at the convening. This is something new and different. And so I'm so excited to be able to welcome Dr. Ben Sommer, who has been such a stalwart of our webinar series, and invite him to share on the origins of the nation, Israel, biblical, historical, and archaeological data. I want to welcome any first-time attendees to our Monday webinar series. It's been, this has been going on for about 4 years, but this is a newer way of approaching, and so thank you for joining us. I also want to thank today's sponsor at the Navi level, Yael Asbel, who is a JTS trustee, has supported this session. So thank you so much. You too could sponsor a session. If you're inspired, please check out our website to get more information. We have 3 sponsorship levels, and we're going to post a link in the chat. But this is such a great way of honoring or commemorating an anniversary or honoring a person through JTS Learning. So please consider that. The recording of this session and all other sessions are available on the site. So for the series, and we just posted a link for that in the chat. Dr. Sommer is going to speak, and we'll have a couple of breaks through the session where you'll be able to ask questions. You can send your questions to me, and I am delighted to be able to share them with him. We're going to get through a lot of intense history today, so I'm excited to see where the questions go and where Dr. Sommer takes us. If you have technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with Tani Schwartz-Herman, who's on the JTS, who's my colleague at JTS, and thank you, Tani, for helping us. The sources for today were sent in your email, and they also are about to appear in our chat. We're going to kind of reference the sources as Dr. Sommer gets into his talk, but then actually he asks that you maybe pull them up on your screen and look back at them, because it's not going to be, it's more of a reference sheet as opposed to a direct presentation. Finally, before I'd like to introduce Dr. Sommer. He joined the Jewish Theological Seminary faculty as a professor of Bible in July 2008. Previously, he served as the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies at Northwestern, where he taught since 1994. Dr. Sommer has been a fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies at Hebrew University, the Tikva Center for Jewish Law and Civilization, and the New York University School of Law, the Shalom Hartman Institute, and more. He served as a visiting faculty member at Hebrew U as well. And he's written extensively. And one of the things that we always find in a session with Dr. Sommer is that there's so much insight into the kind of makeup of the Torah itself, and then pulling in all of these other sources, and it just gives you such a different sense. So I'm of the source text of the broader world in which the text was produced, and I'm really excited to see this, the lens of Israel and Zionism through Dr. Sommer's sources and work. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ellie. And thank you, Yael, who will be watching this on a recording, I think. And thank you to all of you who have come out today. It's a delight, of course, to see a number of friends and former students as well, or I should say students, once a student, always a student, on the screen today, and also a lot of names and faces that I don't know. So it's a delight to meet some new people as well. So I'll be talking today about what we might refer to in Aramaic and Talmudic Aramaic as an inyan diyuma, inyan shel hayom, a contemporary concern. I want to start today from acknowledging that especially in the past year, we've been hearing that Jews, we're told, are not indigenous to the land variously known as Canaan, Israel, or Palestine. This has been a point that anti-Zionist propagandists have been asserting, and it occurs to me as a biblical scholar that it is possible that some of these propagandists might try to support this contention that Jews are not indigenous to Canaan, Israel, Palestine by referring to some theories among academics that have come out in the past 3 decades regarding the origins of the Jewish people, the origins, that is to say, of the Israelite nation, and also regarding the origins of the Bible itself, the origins of the writings that we find in the Bible. So I'd like to talk about those theories, first of all, for the first part of our session. And what I'd like to do is to explain several reasons that those theories cannot support the claim that the Jewish people is not indigenous to the region in question. Then I'd like to move on a little bit more and briefly talk about some other theories about the origin of the Israelites and the origin of the Bible that I'll have time to do just very, very briefly. So most of my time I'll be spending on this particular set of theories from just the last few decades, and why those theories don't support what certain propagandists would want them to support. To do that, I'll need to do a few things. So I'm just going to give you a quick outline of where we're heading over the next few minutes. First of all, I just need to summarize the theories in question, which I'll do. Then I'll need to explain why those theories, even if we accept those theories, don't support the political claims to which some anti-Zionist propagandists might want to put them. Third, I'd like to point out why those theories, in any event, have not won acceptance among biblical scholars and archaeologists, but are largely, or at this point, pretty much universally regarded as false. And having done that, that is, having devoted some time to an unsound theory, I'd like to spend at least a few minutes at the end providing some information on serious and respectable theories among modern scholars about the origin of the nation Israel. But before any of that, it will be useful for us to get a sense of timeline, the timeline of the biblical period, since I'm going to be referring to certain places and especially certain terms having to do with time. So you've all got the PDF, but just for convenience, we're screen sharing this timeline right now. I do wonder, Tani, can we make that screen share bigger, or is it just small on my end? Um, uh, yeah, let's see. So we've made that a little bigger, but now we can't see the whole page. So we can Tiny will kind of move it around as I'm talking. Some of you might find it easier just to download either from the email you received earlier today, or from the chat box within Zoom. You might want to just download the PDF and bring the PDF up on your own screen. That might be a bit more convenient. Great, thanks, Tani, Tani just put up that URL that you can click on to get this timeline. There's also a map on the second page of the timeline, which we'll look at just briefly. So let me just say a few things about just some terminology I'll be using. When we're talking about the ancient world, there are a number of different periods. We're going to start off, I'll just mention that the Middle Bronze Age goes roughly from about 2000 BCE until about 1550 BCE. And that would probably be roughly the time of the Avot, that is to say, the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Probably, I'm saying probably because the truth is historically, we really can't find anything about the Avot beyond what is available in the biblical text itself. But if you do the math, that probably would be the time of the Avot. Then we get into the late Bronze Age. That's roughly, when we're talking about the ancient Near East, at least 1550 BCE until about 1200 BCE. One might want to locate the Avot then as well. That would be the time of enslavement in Egypt in all likelihood. That will be this time of certain pharaohs. There's something called the Merneptah stele that was put up with a pharaoh named Merneptah, which we will come back to briefly. That's the late Bronze Age. Then we get into the Iron Age. For our purposes, talking about the history of ancient Israel, that will go from roughly 1200 BCE until 586 BCE. Uh, that's a time in which the land that was in antiquity known as Canaan, the land roughly between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, that's the time that Egyptian control over that land came to an end as, for one thing, sea peoples, especially the Philistines, were arriving in the land of Canaan and to some extent even in North Africa. Coming from Greece, from elsewhere in the Mediterranean. And at the same time, there are new settlements from some new population showing up in the central hill country of Canaan. Those are the first Israelites that we really know about archaeologically or historically. As these two new peoples are coming in, Egyptian control over this area recedes, and we go into really politically and culturally a whole new era. Within that time period, there's also what we could call the time of the United Monarchy. So about 2 centuries into this time frame, it would appear to be the case that the first Israelite Judean kings ruled over this area. That's what those would be King Saul, King David, King Solomon, roughly in the 11th and 10th centuries. Then we go to the time of the divided monarchy, in which there was a southern kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, ruled over by the Davidic dynasty, and a northern kingdom of Israel, also known as Ephraim, with its capital in Samaria. That time of the divided monarchy probably starts, and here we're getting to the point where we can probably begin to date things a little more precisely. It starts probably around 928 BCE. That northern kingdom falls, that is the capital city of Samaria and the kingdom of which it is the capital, fall to the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. The southern kingdom, that is the kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem, falls to the Babylonian Empire in 586 BCE. And we come to the end of what, for biblical studies or for the history of ancient Israel, the end of what we call the Iron Age. Incidentally, Tani, if we could just go to that second page for a second, or if people who have it on their own can go to the second page of the PDF, there's just a little map there in case you're not remembering your geography. So when we're talking about the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, I've given you a reference to Jerusalem and Samaria, the two capitals. I show you where the Assyrian Empire and Babylonian Empire were located over in Mesopotamia. There's one arrow number 7 in purple, shows you at southern Mesopotamia where the city of Babylon is located. The capital cities of the Assyrian Empire are further north. Those are Nineveh and Ashur, numbers 5 and 6. You can go back and refer to these maps if it's helpful, if you'd like. Tanya, let's go back, please, to the first page of the handout. Let me just mention a few other terms that we'll be throwing around. So when the Babylonian Empire destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem, ends the independence of the kingdom of Judah, we get into the exilic period, in which much of the population, especially the more elite parts of the population of the kingdom of Judah, are forced to resettle in Babylonia, in Mesopotamia. They're forced to resettle there as exiles, and we go into the exilic period, which goes from 586 to 538 BCE. In 538 BCE, the Persians, whom actually, I did not put Persia on that map, and I really should have, but they're just to the east, to the right of Mesopotamia on that map. The Persians, led by Cyrus, King Cyrus, conquer Babylonia in 538, and they permit Judean exiles to return, if they want to the land of Judah, to the land of Israel, to the area around Jerusalem. So the exilic period comes to an end at 538, and we go into a period that we could call by any of a number of names. The dates differ depending on which name we decide to use. We could talk about just the post-exilic period or the Persian period, which begins with the Persian conquest of the Babylonian Empire in 538 BCE. Judah now is no longer under the control of the Babylonians. It's now part of the Persian Empire instead, governed by a Persian appointee, but they're usually appointing somebody from the Judean population, initially someone from the royal family, the Davidic family. Later, other people are appointed as the governor of this province. The Persians allow the Judeans who have returned to Jerusalem to rebuild the Jerusalem temple on the Temple Mount. That happens in 517 BCE. They finally are able to complete building a small temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And so we could say that the Persian era begins in 538 BCE, or the post-exilic era. If you want to call it the Second Temple era, technically that would begin in 517 BCE. Then in 336 BCE, Alexander comes from Greece, conquers the Persian Empire, and he takes over control of the province of Judah. Otherwise, very little changes. But now we could say that we're in the Hellenistic era. Eventually, we all know the story that's coming up in our calendar very soon. The Maccabean or Hasmonean family revolts against the Syrian Greeks who were in control of Judah around actually in 166 BCE. Judah evolves into more of an independent kingdom under the Hasmonean dynasty. We again now have, for the first time since 586, an independent Judean state whose independence ends, however, in the year 63 BCE, when the Romans enter Judah and decide that they'll rule it instead of there being an independent Jewish kingdom there. Okay, that's just a very quick um, uh, tour of ancient Israelite history. People might want to keep that PDF on one side of your screen to refer to some terms, as I'll be using these terms in the course of the lecture. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to talk about this very controversial school of biblical researchers, archaeological researchers, that has developed over roughly the past, actually really, I said 30, but it's really almost the past 40 years. I'd like to describe their rather radical views. Then I'd like to explain why those views cannot be supported to support an anti-Zionist propaganda. I'd also like to explain why those views have not won any acceptance among biblical scholars generally. And then I'd like to say a few more things just about the origin of the Israelites. So the school that I'm talking about, the school of thought, it's often referred to as the minimalist school, because they radically minimalize the extent to which we can consider biblical texts to be in any way historically accurate. It's also called the Copenhagen or the Copenhagen School or the Sheffield School because the professors who put forward these theories were, for the most part, faculty members at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark and at the University of Sheffield in England. So what are the views of this school? I'm going to sketch out the basic minimalist idea. The truth is that there are differences among different professors who have written as members of the school. They take the theories take various forms, but an especially extreme version runs as follows. According to the minimalists, the Jews or Israelites of the post-exilic period, Jews or Israelites of the post-exilic period are not in fact descended or were not in fact descended from people who had lived in the land of Canaan and who were exiled from there by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. They're not descended from people who were native to there, as the Bible claims. Rather, the minimalists claim the people that come to be the Jews, that we know as the Jewish people, the Judeans, the Israelites, however we want to call them, they were largely people of Mesopotamian origin. Again, you can look at that map just to remember where Mesopotamia is, roughly Iraq, the northwestern part of northeastern part of Syria, southeastern part of Turkey of today. They were largely of Mesopotamian origin. These were people from Mesopotamia whom the Persians moved to Canaan following their defeat of the Babylonians in 538 BCE. In other words, according to the minimalists, the first Jews were a type of settler colonialist, not natives of Canaan, but rather foreigners imported into Canaan for the purpose of furthering the Persian Empire's strategic aims. Now, to support their own claim to this land, these imported Mesopotamians adopted the names of some Canaanite groups who had lived there prior to the Babylonian conquest, specifically the names Judah and Israel. And while some descendants of the original Judeans and Israelites might have intermixed and intermarried with these newcomers, the polity and the culture and the religion of these newcomers were created, they were basically new inventions created in the post-exilic period with little connection to Iron Age Judah or Israel. The books of the Bible, according to the minimalists, the books of the Bible do not, in fact, date to the pre-exilic era, that is, to the Iron Age, while biblical books probably make use of some vaguely remembered historical memories or mythical traditions that originated with the real ancient Israelites. For the most part, these books are fictions invented in the Persian era to supply these Mesopotamian settler colonialists with a forged claim to legitimacy in their new home. And thus, the minimalists, unlike the mainstream of modern biblical scholarship, regard the Bible as almost entirely the product of the Persian and Hellenistic era. Whereas most biblical scholars would say that the Bible was written in the Iron Age and to some extent in the exilic period and also to some extent in the Persian period. The minimalists are saying it's all pretty much from the Persian and even the Hellenistic eras. There's almost nothing that's earlier than that. Now you can see why a contemporary anti-Zionist propagandist might want to embrace the work of the minimalists. The minimalists say of the Second Temple period Jews that the same thing that many contemporary anti-Zionists say of Israeli Jews. They aren't really from Canaan or Palestine. They're settler colonialists. They didn't belong there even in ancient times, and they therefore presumably don't belong there today. I'd like to point out, first of all, though, that this potential use of minimalist historiography just doesn't work for a very simple reason. The core claim of the Zionist movement is that the Jewish people comes from the region between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, whether we want to refer to that strip of land as Canaan, which is a name that was used already in the Bronze Age, as Israel, a name that came to be used starting in the Iron Age, or as Palestine, a name that started to be used in the Roman era. For Zionists, Jews have a claim, though not necessarily an exclusive claim, to this land, because that's where the Jewish people originated. That's where Jewish people lived in antiquity. And the fact is that the minimalists do not deny that. According to the minimalists, the Jewish nation, what we know today as the Jewish nation, did in fact originate in the land in question between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. They didn't, according to the minimalists, they didn't originate there during the Iron Age, but they did nevertheless originate there. The minimalists differ from biblical scholars of various stripes in claiming that this origination occurred much, much later than everybody else thinks. But it did still happen on that particular piece of real estate. And thus, I don't think that the minimalists' recreation of ancient history, in fact, supports anti-Zionist propaganda. After all, the opening lines of the Israeli Declaration of Independence read as follows: Be'eretz Yisrael kam ha'am ha'yehudi, ba'utzva dmuto haruchanit, hadatit v'hamedinit, ba'chai chaye komamiyut mamlachtit. In the land of Israel, the Jewish people came into existence. There, its spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. There, it lived a life of in an independent polity. The opening lines of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, though, do not state, in the land of Israel, the Jewish people came to exist. There, its spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped, specifically at the beginning of the Iron Age or the very, very end of the Late Bronze Age. And if it was any later than that, forget about it, we're all going back to Poland. That's not what Zionist ideology says. It doesn't say it has to have happened specifically at the end of the Late Bronze Age, beginning of the Iron Age. It simply states the basic idea is that that's where Jews are from, and therefore Jews have a right to that land. Again, not necessarily a unique right, not necessarily an exclusive right, but a right to that land. So one can see on the one hand why, on a facile level, the minimalist theories might attract anti-Zionist propagandists. But the truth is that the minimalist theories have no bearing on the core claim of Zionism. If the Jewish people emerged in Canaan in the late 500s BCE, rather than, say, the 1200s BCE, the fact remains, even in the view of the minimalists, that the Jewish people did emerge there, that Jews lived there for centuries, that Jewish polities existed there, sometimes under Persian or Greek or Roman jurisdiction, and for a while as an independent state. And all this was true a millennium before the Arab invasion of Palestine during the Rashidun Caliphate in the mid 7th century CE. So, on just a basic level, I think if one thinks for a second, I think one can see that minimalism really has nothing to contribute to a contemporary discussion of politics in the Near East. Um, Having spent some time on describing the minimalists, I'd like to spend just like 5 more minutes pausing to note something to explain why the bold theories of the minimalists, of these people from Copenhagen and Sheffield, have not attracted agreement outside their own very small circle of activists. And then I'd like to pause for some questions before moving on to some other more serious theories. So if people have some questions, you can send them in the chat again to Ellie Gettinger, excuse me. But let me just say a few things about why these theories that first were proposed starting in the early 1990s uh, haven't attracted agreement among scholars. They have attracted a great deal of attention, I think, in scholarly discourse in the 1990s and in the 2000s. They attracted a great deal of attention, I think, in the popular press. I remember there's an article about this school in Harper's Magazine, for example. But these scholars didn't succeed in convincing biblical scholars of their theories. And the fact is that today there are pretty much no minimalist scholars left within the field of biblical studies. Even at the University of Copenhagen and the University of Sheffield, when these scholars retired, their replacements didn't hold the same opinions. They didn't produce students who continued their work within the Guild of Biblical Scholarship. This was a kind of a controversial and radical theory that got a lot of attention, was widely discussed, and then has pretty much died. So let me explain to you why scholars were not convinced by the minimalists' claims. First of all, the claim that the entire Bible was written in the Persian and Hellenistic periods, and therefore it doesn't tell us anything about the Iron Age. The claim that the Bible was written entirely in the Persian and Hellenistic eras is just completely impossible for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is linguistic. Based on both biblical texts, but also texts found by archaeologists, historians of language can and have created a clear typology of different periods of ancient Hebrew. There's a clear difference between late biblical Hebrew, which is the Hebrew that we find in texts and inscriptions dating to the post-exilic era, and classical biblical Hebrew, which is the biblical Hebrew of the Iron Age. We can even furthermore distinguish between archaic biblical Hebrew, which is the Hebrew of the very beginning of the Iron Age, of which we have very, very little, classical biblical Hebrew, of which we have a whole lot more, and late biblical Hebrew, which is the post-Iron Age Hebrew. Much of the Bible is written in a consistent classical biblical Hebrew. Most of the books, with the exception of a few verses or chapters here or there, from Genesis up until about Isaiah, is written in pure classical biblical Hebrew. Linguistically, it's just not possible that those texts were written in the Persian or Hellenistic era. Had they been written there, assuming that none of the scribes in the Persian and Hellenistic era had access to a time machine, which would have allowed them to travel to the late 20th century and do a PhD in linguistics and begin to understand how language had changed in the Near East. Assuming that none of them had an access to a time machine, there's no way Jewish scribes in the Persian and Hellenistic era could have written the books of Genesis through Isaiah and then a bunch of other books later, then it gets more complicated, in such a pure Iron Age Hebrew. Linguistically, the minimalist theories just don't take into account the existence of the field of historical linguistics. I could say a bit more about that, but let me just move on to note that also culturally, the Bible is a classic age of Iron Age and I'm sorry, the Bible is a classic example of Iron Age and late Bronze Age Near Eastern literature. The world of the Bible, with the obvious exception of the late books of the Bible, like Esther or Daniel, the world of the Bible is clearly the world that we find in Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, and Egyptian literature of the late second millennium and the early first millennium BCE. When we get into Jewish literature of the Hellenistic and Persian eras, it's a different kind of literature. It's a different world that's being portrayed. It reflects a very different world. So when we look at Esther or Daniel or the Dead Sea Scrolls or the writing of Hellenistic Jewish authors who wrote in Greek, we're looking at a completely different world when you compare that literature to other Hellenistic period literature. Yes, it's clear that late biblical literature or the post-biblical Jewish literature, it belongs in that Persian and Hellenistic period. Most of the Bible stems from the Iron Age culture, the late Bronze Age culture of the Near East. The claim that Jews hadn't previously lived in Canaan prior to the Babylonian exile is similarly absurd. For one thing, if that were really the case, why did these Mesopotamian settler colonialists end up writing their language in their literature and speaking Hebrew? Why did they end up writing their literature in Hebrew, which is a dialect of Canaanite? Why weren't they speaking and writing in a Mesopotamian language, specifically Aramaic or Akkadian? It's just not believable that this settler colonialist group would have completely adopted a different language and then written that language so well rather than using their own language to write up this literature. Religiously, furthermore, the idea that worshiping only one God was the invention of these Second Temple period settler colonialists isn't a plausible idea because we do have pre-exilic inscriptions discovered by archaeologists from Judah and Israel, that is Iron Age inscriptions, that indicate that already in the Iron Age, Israelites largely worshipped only one God, whom they called by a particular name, which would be spelled with the letters in Hebrew Yud, He, Vav, and He, that is Y, H, W, and H. That's already the case in the Iron Age, well before the Babylonian exile. The notion that the worship of a single God was one of these inventions of this settler colonialist group, it's just not supported by the archaeological records. One last point, and then I'd love to get to some questions. In the last roughly 2.5 decades, a number of documents from Mesopotamia, from Babylonia, have been discovered that preserve records of a place called Al-Yahudu, which literally means sort of Jew city or Jew town in Mesopotamia. Al-Yahudu, that's an Akkadian or a Babylonian name. These are records, letters, economic records, business records of exiled Judeans from the beginning of the exilic period. There are also similar records in this collection that's been found from other exiled peoples from the town of the Ashkelon exiles, the town of the Gaza exiles. So various Phoenician peoples of Philistine descent who were also exiled to Babylonia. They all had their own towns, and records have been found of these people dating to the beginning of the exilic period, to the first generation of the exile. The Judeans, all whose records have been found, are clearly people who had been moved from Judah to Babylonia. They're clearly people who are descended from these people who were worshiping only this one God back in the land of Judah before the exile. In other words, these are clearly exiled Judeans from whose population the returnees of the post-exilic period were drawn. The minimalists want to claim that the Jewish people and their religious culture were an invention of the early Persian era, but a full generation before the Persian era began, we already see that this people exists, and they were among several groups of refugees from Canaan whom the Babylonians had forcibly resettled in Mesopotamia. The existence of the Al-Yahudu documents is one of several pieces of evidence that utterly destroys the claims of the minimalists. In fairness to the minimalists, when the minimalists started writing their work, the Al-Yahudu documents were not yet known. They have only been discovered and published in the last roughly 2.5 decades. In short, minimalists are completely wrong about the origin of the Jewish people, of the ancient Israelites, of the Bible. Their theories really can't be considered serious academic work. So I'd like to say a few things about more serious academic work, but let me pause here and see, are there any questions so far before we leave the minimalists behind and I move on to more serious scholarship?
There's so many questions. We
Hmm.
probably, but I'm going to say that a lot of the questions kind of go into the zone of what was the initial, you said this is about 40 years ago, was this a politically motivated piece that came out of this? Um, so a lot of the questions kind of are centered on this idea of where are they coming from and how do they discount all of the other pieces of evidence that do not kind of ascribe to their theory.
Gotcha. So those are two different questions. So let me address both of them in a frank manner. The first question is, where are they coming from? What might be motivating Philip Davids, Keith Whitlam from the University of Sheffield, Thomas Thompson, Niels Peter Lemke from the University of Copenhagen? Um, I didn't say anything at all about the motivation of these scholars because I think for me as a scholar, their motivations are irrelevant. When deciding on the validity or invalidity of a thesis, of a theory, the possible motivations of the people coming up with a theory are really not pertinent. Uh, it's possible that a person would come up with a very, very strong theory for a reason that seems illegitimate or impure, right? You could have a right theory for the wrong reason. Like you could be motivated to have a particular theory and you looked into it and you found good evidence. It turns out your theory is right. And the fact that your motive was a bad motive is totally irrelevant. The only question that matters is how does the theory explain the evidence? Does the evidence support the theory? Does the evidence not support the theory? So I deliberately don't want to talk about possible motives of these scholars, whom I don't particularly know. I mean, I've been in email contact with a few of them. Tommy Thompson was once over for dinner at my house. But what their motives are, I don't really want to talk about that because that question I don't think is relevant. I do think it's unfortunately the case very often, even in academic discourse, that people impugn a theory by impugning the motive behind the theory. And that's really what's called an argument ad hominem. That's not really arguing against the theory, it's arguing against the person who holds the theory. There can be very good people who have bad theories, who just don't use evidence well. And the fact that they're nice guys doesn't mean that we should accept their theories. And there can be people who are less good, who have good theories. And so I deliberately chose not to talk about any possible motives. It's something that people do discuss. I don't think a Bible scholar such as myself should be discussing that question. It's not really relevant to the validity or lack of validity of the theory. How do these scholars deal with the massive amount of data that shows that they're wrong? Honestly, I think with desperation, intellectual dishonesty, and fraud. Their use of sources. If you check their footnotes, if you go and read the secondary literature that they're citing, is so poor that I've been trying to avoid using the word scholarship or scholar to describe them because honestly, their use of primary and secondary literature is just so bad that I don't think that we can really describe this genuinely as scholarship, even though there were at least two universities in Europe that did hire these people. Nonetheless, after they retired, even those universities did not continue hiring people who published this sort of work. I'll just give you one or two examples. I was actually in the room when Phil Davies first became aware of the fact there's such a thing as the scholarly study of the Hebrew language. He had not known that, and he was really blindsided when some people asked this question. It was a small seminar at the University of Chicago somewhere in the early 1990s. And he really didn't know what to say. He obviously just hadn't known that since the late 19th century, there have been scholars who write on this question of the history of the Hebrew language. There's a clear distinction between classical Biblical Hebrew and late Biblical Hebrew. That clear distinction is evident in the archaeologically discovered Hebrew texts that we have. And the same distinction then applies to, let's say, Genesis and Exodus as classical Biblical Hebrew versus Esther or Daniel as a clear example of late Biblical Hebrew. He was unaware of that. I later read a lecture he gave at a conference that he sent to me, attacking the main scholar who has done a lot of work on this, a scholar from Hebrew University named Avi Horvitz. He had a full-fledged, largely ad hominem attack on Avi Horvitz, but he actually hadn't read Horvitz's work. I'll just give you one example out of dozens of pages, out of dozens that I could give you. One of the points he tries to make to say, well, Horvitz's work is illegitimate. We shouldn't listen to his description of the difference between late Biblical Hebrew and classical Biblical Hebrew because the texts that he deals with are all prose texts. He doesn't pay attention to poetry. And once you start looking at the different linguistic register that you've got in poetry, everything could be completely different. Now, actually, Avi Horvitz at this point in time had published not one, but two books on the linguistic dating of ancient Hebrew poetry. In fact, he began this theory in his first book, which I have sitting right over there on the shelf. In his book, Ben Lashon LeLashon, he began his work with the analysis of poetry. So early in Avi Horvitz's career, you might have criticized him by saying, you're dealing always with poetic texts. Until you deal with the prose text, we don't really know if your theory is legitimate. And he did move on later in his career to deal in abundant publications with prose language texts. But the fact that Phil Davies was criticizing Avi Horvitz for not dealing with poetry, when in fact he had written two books on the linguistic study of biblical poetry. I mean, it shows the level of scholarly malfeasance that I think these scholars, these professors, they're not really scholars, were guilty of. I will say that Thomas Thompson wrote a really important book in the 1970s, challenging the way that biblical scholars were reconstructing biblical history. It was an important and an influential text. That was really serious scholarship. I don't agree with everything that's in that book, but there's a lot of good criticisms of earlier scholars of the regnant scholarly position of that era. That's a really great work of scholarship. And I think that he went from there to works that cannot unfortunately be described as scholarship. Other questions, Ellie, or should I?
There's so many questions, but I also want to make sure that we have time to get into the more nuanced and well-researched scholarship. So let's save some of these for the end.
Okay, so I'll just spend 10 minutes having spent 45 minutes talking about nonsense, but important nonsense. Let me move on to the way responsible scholars view the origin of the Israelites. In the late 20th century, throughout the 20th century, this is a huge area of debate among serious biblical critics, historians of the ancient Near East, and archaeologists. And there are a lot of different theories about where the Israelites come from. Some of these theories hewed closer to the biblical narrative, to what you find in Genesis, Exodus, Joshua. They claim that the Israelites, at least in part, are descended from Mesopotamian migrants in the Middle Bronze Age who settled down in the land of Canaan, also descended from escaped Egyptian slaves, people who had been enslaved in Egypt. this school of thought, couple of schools of thought, actually think that the stories of conquest in the book of Joshua, the Israelite conquest in the book of Joshua, are based on some sort of real historical memories. They point out that several cities, Chatzor, Beit El, Lachish, Tel Beit Mirsam, were in fact, according to archaeologists, were in fact destroyed at the beginning of the Iron Age, which is when Joshua should be coming in to the land of Canaan and conquering it. Um, Others actually think that the Israelites don't necessarily come from Mesopotamia, that they were nomads that came from further south, from the Sinai, from what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia, but that they come into the land of Canaan from outside. So that's one set of schools of thought. Other scholars, though, already beginning in the 1950s, regard the Israelites actually as being a subset of the Canaanites. They don't think that the book of Genesis, in claiming that the Israelites have this Mesopotamian ancestry from the Middle Bronze Age, they don't think that that's actually true. They think that basically the Israelites are descended from Canaanites who moved from the flat hill country in the Shephelah near the Mediterranean Sea, who moved up to the hill country of the land of Canaan, which had been sparsely populated previously, who moved up there at the beginning of the Iron Age. And so they think that the development of the Israelite nation was more of a peaceful process, not a conquest. And they point out that actually some of the descriptions in the book of Joshua of cities being conquered by Joshua refer to cities like Jericho and Ai that were not, so far as we can tell, conquered at that time. In fact, these are cities that didn't seem to have existed as significant settlements at all at the time that Joshua is coming into the land, supposedly was coming into the land of Canaan. That is the beginning of the Iron Age. So there was a huge debate among scholars. I'm oversimplifying, but we could basically say it's a debate between people who say Israelites are really a subset of Canaanites. They're peculiar Canaanites who moved up the hill into the highlands of Canaan, developed a somewhat more egalitarian society, and began to develop this weird religion in which they pretty much worship just one God. Other scholars say Israelites came from outside of Canaan, um, uh, and they therefore were originally not a native group, but they settled down starting at the very beginning of the Iron Age, maybe the very, very end of the Late Bronze Age. Both groups can point to evidence on their side. I mean, just really quickly. Um, Hebrew is a Canaanite language. The fact that the Israelites are speaking a Canaanite language supports the idea that originally they were Canaanites. And there are certain archaeological similarities between their material culture and regular Canaanite material culture. On the other hand, other scholars point out that there are a lot of things about the archaeological culture of the Israelites, the archaeological finds in Israelite settlements that are quite distinctive that we don't see elsewhere. For example, the form of the house. They have a particular form of the Israelite house. It's known as the four-roomed house or Beit Arba'at HaMerchavim. There's their pottery, the pottery they use is also used by the Canaanites, but the Israelites really only use this one kind of pottery. They don't have the rich assemblage of pottery that regular Canaanites have. There's evidence on both sides. What's happened, I think, in the last two or so decades, 2.5 decades, is that something of a consensus has, and a very sensible consensus has begun to emerge, in part on the basis of new evidence and in part on the basis of going through the debates from the late 20th century. First, it's clear that, and here people might want to go and look again at the handout where it says Iron Age. It's clear, this is the second bullet point in where it says under Iron Age. At the time that the book of Joshua says the Israelites are supposedly arriving in the land of Canaan to conquer the land of Canaan, it's clear that suddenly a new group of people are emerging in the highlands of Canaan. Whereas before the Iron Age, there were only about 29 settlements in the highland of the land of Canaan. There are about 225 new settlements that show up there in the 12th through 11th centuries, and then an additional 226 new settlements that show up in the 10th through the 7th centuries. So when the Israelites are supposedly arriving in Canaan, according to the Bible, that's exactly when these new settlements emerge. And it's clear that the people in these new settlements are Israelites, or if you prefer to call them proto-Israelites. They're using the four-room house. They're using the kind of pottery that Israelites continue to use. Very, very interestingly, they don't eat pork. Canaanites, Philistines eat larger amounts of pork. Archaeologists, when they dig up a place, they look at the bones to see what were people eating. And in this new population that appears in the highlands of Canaan at the beginning of the Iron Age, they don't eat pork. That's a very, very big difference from their neighbors and their predecessors. It's very, very clear. The Israelites are arriving in the land of Canaan when the Bible says they should. To what extent where they're coming from is harder to say, but I think there too, a consensus has emerged. I think we could say that the reason all the different theories, other than the minimalist nonsense, at the end of the 20th century were able to point to evidence is that all these theories are correct. Especially a scholar named an archaeologist named Ann Killebrew from Penn State, another archaeologist named Avraham Faust from Bar-Ilan University. In 2005, 2006, each of them publishes a book making the point that the Israelites are, to use Killebrew's language, a mixed multitude. They're of Canaanite ancestry. They're probably in part of Egyptian ancestry. Actually, the one pre-Israelite four-room house that has been discovered is actually in late Bronze Age Egypt, in the Delta region where the Israelites were supposedly enslaved. Probably there are some enslaved people who were enslaved in Egypt, people who were coming from Mesopotamia, lots of local Canaanites, probably certain kinds of nomads from the south of the land of Canaan. They're coming together at the beginning of the Iron Age to form this new identity, which is Israelite identity. And it's an identity that centers around a certain story and loyalty to a certain God. I'll just mention two other pieces of evidence here that are really relevant. When you look at archaeological remains from these people in the highlands, and you look at what names they use, overwhelmingly, a professor from Penn named Jeff Teague, a graduate of JTS actually, Teague already pointed out in the late 1980s that when you look at the archaeologically attested names of Israelites in the Iron Age, they only they overwhelmingly use the name of the Israelite God when giving names to their children. That is, a name like Yehonatan, Jonathan, that means the God Yah gave. It was normal in the ancient Near East that names that parents give their children refer to a god. So let's say there's a Babylonian king, Nabuchodonosor. Nebuchadnezzar is how we pronounce it. In the original, Nabuchodonosor means the god Nabu has provided an heir to the king. Or Marduk Iplaidin, another Babylonian king, the god Marduk has given a brother, to the older brother of that king. Israelite names, Jeffrey Teague points out, that are attested archaeologically, they almost never refer to a god other than the god Yah, the God of Israel. That's unique in the entire ancient Near East. Already in the Iron Age, Israelites were very peculiar because they only worship this one god named Yah, or his full name would be spelled with the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey, that nobody else in the ancient Near East was worshiping. Similarly, Patrick Miller from Princeton Theological Seminary went through all the letters that we have from Iron Age Israelites. Archaeologists have found these letters. We can read these letters. He went through all of them and asked, well, what deities do they refer to? If you look at Canaanite letters, Egyptian letters, Babylonian letters, Assyrian letters, Aramean letters, they're referring to lots and lots of different gods and goddesses because they had relationships with lots and lots of different gods and goddesses. These Iron Age Israelites are only referring to this almost exclusively to this one particular god, again, the god Yah. Clearly, these people showing up in the highlands of Canaan, they must be of mixed ancestry because we see evidence that they must be Canaanites in some ways, but they're different from Canaanites in other ways. And they clearly have some connection to Egypt of the time of the Ramesside dynasty, we've got lots of different evidence showing up. They're probably a mixed group of people who were brought together in the highlands of Canaan around a shared story of their rescue by and their loyalty to this particular one God. So I think that by now we've really come to a little bit more of a consensus. The Israelites are already there at the very beginning of the Iron Age, when the book of Joshua says that's when they're getting to the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan. There's disagreement about the extent to which they're conquering versus settling down there. There's ambiguity as to where most of them came from, but clearly, by the very beginning of the Iron Age, an Israelite ethnicity with a distinctive religious culture, a religious culture that, oddly enough, involved not eating pork, they already exist at the beginning of the Iron Age in the highlands of Canaan. There are extra biblical attestations of this people, by the way. I'll just mention also, if you're looking at and I'll end on this, we're just about out of time, but people who want to stay a minute or two, I'm certainly happy to take questions. If you look on the handout, in the late Bronze Age section, the last bullet point refers to the Merneptah stele, dated to 1208 BCE. This is an Egyptian document in which a pharaoh named Merneptah brags about his conquests in Canaan. He mentions several cities where he put down anti-Egyptian insurrections, and then he tells us there was a people whom he destroyed. He said, the people Israel, I've destroyed them, they are no longer. I think it's actually fascinating that the very first datable reference to the nation Israel is talking about how I've taken care of it, it's over, they're done. Turned out he and many people who followed him in history weren't right about this. That's the first reference we get to the Israelites, which seems to locate them in the hill country, in the northern hill country, probably in what's roughly the Galilee. We also get references to the House of David in the time of the divided monarchy, that's mid-9th century, in an Aramaic language inscription put up by an Aramaean king from what is today Syria, who talks about a war with the House of David. That's the first reference to the Davidic dynasty and thus to the kingdom of Judah. From the same century, we have several references to the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. There's the very well-known Mesha inscription from Moab that mentions the Israelites and their God, whose name is spelled with the letters YHWH. There's also two Assyrian steles written in Akkadian, the Korch monolith and the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III. Both of those are from the time of the Emperor Shalmaneser III, that refer to the House of Omri, that is the northern kingdom that was ruled over by King Omri and his descendants. That also make a reference to King Achav or Ahab of the northern kingdom. So by the time we get into the mid-9th century, we're starting to see from outside of Israel multiple references in Aramaean and in Mesopotamian literature to the Israelites. There's one Egyptian reference that's even earlier that. When we get to the end of the 9th century, the 8th century, then we have multiple references to the Israelites, to people that are mentioned in the Bible, to kings in particular, whom we know about from the Bible. That's a quick overview of a more responsible idea that the Israelites are probably a group that comes together in the highlands of Canaan. They come together around a new religious ideal, around a story of being saved from Egyptian slavery, around the idea that we're only going to worship one deity. And that group is identifiable already at the beginning of the Iron Age from a variety of archaeological sources. By the time we get into the 9th century, very, very identifiable from all sorts of different texts that we find around the ancient Near East. Tov, that was a whirlwind
that
tour.
was a whirlwind. We did thousands of years of history and theories in an hour. I'm going to say, can you stay on for a little bit longer?
I'm happy to stay on a little bit longer. I understand that some people need to leave, so don't feel embarrassed if you got to click leave.
You can also find the recording after with the questions and answers. They'll be up on our YouTube page and on our session, our series page. So there are so many questions where people are putting proof text, that the genetic markers between Canaanites and Israelites were the same. This was, and they sent me a citation of a 2020 article that was out in Cell at a number of places. There are people who are asking about, specific finds versus the lack of finds, like the fact that there isn't anything that really shows a archaeological connection of the House of David or the United. Those challenge, the challenging things that don't exist in the archaeological record. And then there's the other camp of people who are presenting the biblical authority. The land was given. This is how, there are these holidays. This is all of the things that are connected. And I think this is an incredible challenge that you've put together so many sources here. So I want to kind of feel out, first of all, your sense of when you're looking at a landscape that is this massive, how do you narrow? And then where are you starting? Are you starting with the Bible and moving to the archaeological, or vice versa? What's your process?
Gotcha. So a few things. Let me address two issues you brought up at the beginning of the question, and I go on to like where do we start? Um, the question of genetic markers is very, very interesting. And that there should be genetic markers that connect Israelites and Canaanites is not surprising, A, to those scholars that claim that the Israelites are in fact a type of Canaanite or that they have a good deal of Canaanite ancestry. I think that they're not surprising to the consensus that I'm describing as emerging. Um, that is to say, I think, as I said before, as Ann Killebrew from Penn State puts it, the Israelites are a mixed multitude. There are probably lots of different people within their ancestry, but one very prominent group clearly must be the Canaanites. And I'm saying that primarily because we Jews speak Hebrew. And since the early Iron Age, we've been speaking Hebrew. Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect. It's not a South Arabian dialect closer to Arabic. It's not an East Akkadian, I'm sorry, an East Semitic. It's not a South Semitic dialect closer to Arabic. It's not an East Semitic dialect closer to Akkadian. It's a Northwest Semitic language. And within the Northwest Semitic languages, there's the Aramaic branch and the Canaanite branch. It's from the Canaanite branch. And so I think that that clearly shows that among the Israelites' ancestors, there's got to be a lot of Canaanites. And actually, like the Bible in Genesis and Deuteronomy and other parts of the Bible wants to stress Mesopotamian ancestry. They want to say our ancestors, actually, they're not from here originally. God brought them here from northwestern Mesopotamia, from the area around Haran. If you look at again at the map here, I actually point out Haran for you. Maybe Abraham came from Ur, which is also on that map. Probably not. Probably they were from northwestern Mesopotamia. The Bible wants to stress that there's Mesopotamian ancestry, and I think there's no reason to doubt that. People were moving around the ancient Near East. We know about Amorites moving west, moving east, moving back. So that there's Mesopotamian ancestry, I think is quite believable. But the Bible stresses that. But here and there, the Bible, if only accidentally or grudgingly, acknowledges that we have Canaanite ancestry too. So, for example, when it tells us that David conquers the city of Jerusalem, it doesn't tell us that David then slaughtered all the inhabitants of Jerusalem or that David kicked them out. So far as we can tell, they were just issued new identity cards and they continued living in Jerusalem. And that's probably true of a lot of other areas as well. It's interesting also that we have a famous story in 2 Samuel about David's warrior Uriah Hachiti, Uriah the Hittite, and Uriah's wife Bathsheba. Uriah the Hittite is a fascinating name, and that name tells us something really important about the origin of the Israelites, even if you don't believe the story, even if you actually think that that particular story is a piece of fiction. You don't believe that there ever was a guy with that name. The fact that somebody plausibly said that there would be an Israelite warrior, Judean warrior of that name is fascinating because the name Uriah is clearly a uniquely Israelite name. The Yah suffix, Uriah, my light, is the god Yah. That name is a uniquely Israelite name. No other people in the ancient Near East use that divine name, pray to that deity. But he's also referred to as the Hittite. Now, this gets a little confusing. When the Bible says Hittite, it doesn't mean to refer to the Indo-European people who had a Middle Bronze and Late Bronze empire located in what is now Turkey. You can see I circle that area on the map. When the Bible says Hittite, it actually means by Hittite a subset of Canaanites. It's essentially a synonym for Canaanites. So the Bible's telling us here that there was a clearly Israelite guy whose parents were obviously Israelite, who gave a distinctly Israelite name to their child, and they're known as being Hittites. Um, why is there an Israelite family who are known as, with kind of the family name, the Hittites, for the same reason, presumably, that there was a Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem in the 19th century whose last name was Ashkenazi. Um, there must have been some Ashkenazic family who migrated into the Sephardic world, eventually settled down there, became part of a Sephardic community, and they were always known as they're the Ashkenazic family. So their family name was the Ashkenazim. But by the time Rav Ashkenazi was the chief Sephardic rabbi in Jerusalem in the 19th century, they had been Sephardic for a long time. By telling us that there's an Israelite whose last name, so to speak, is the Hittite, the Bible is acknowledging here that there are Israelites of Canaanite extraction. There's lots more evidence of this elsewhere in the Bible. I'll give just one other piece involving not actually Canaanites, but involving a nomadic group south of Canaan. Early biblical books like Genesis, Samuel, refer to a nomadic group of tribes known as the Kenites and the Kenizzites, who were on friendly terms with the Judeans. They lived south of Judah. They got along well with the Judeans. By the time you get to post-exilic biblical literature, so the Book of Chronicles in particular, which is a post-exilic Persian period book that is in the Bible, written in LBH, in Late Biblical Hebrew, they refer to the Kenizzites and the Kenites as being descendants of Judah, the son of Jacob. In other words, when you go from in the pre-exilic books, they're described as foreigners that we're friendly with, nomads who live near us that we get along well with. In post-exilic literature, they're described as being part of our family. They have a genealogy connecting them directly to Jacob. What's happened here is that in the interim, this foreign group has assimilated into the Israelites. And in the ancient Near East, when a group would assimilate into a new group, they would be provided with a new genealogy. We actually have records of this from the Late Bronze Age in northwestern Mesopotamia. It's done consciously. You are now a descendant of so-and-so, my great-great uncle. Now we are kin. Yesterday you weren't, today you are. As of now, you're part of our ethnicity. This actually happens consciously in the ancient Near East. Of course, we still do this today. Whenever we're calling someone up to the Torah as, so-and-so, Ben Avraham V'Sarah, we're providing that person with a genealogy. When a person decides to become Jewish, that person is provided with a genealogy. That person is a full-fledged member of our family because that person is a descendant of Abraham and Sarah, just like the rest of us. Legally speaking, that's the parentage. So that process, that we see happening, in that case, in the Book of Chronicles with the Kenites and the Kenizzites, that's a process that was happening all the time. Finding Canaanite DNA among the Israelites, therefore, is exactly what we would expect. I would only add that because the land of Canaan is located where Africa and Asia meet, and not that far from where Asia Minor goes up into Europe, it's always been an area where populations are moving through. And that was the case in antiquity. That was the case in the 19th century. That's the case in the 20th century. There's lots of new groups of people moving in and settling down. And so we would expect a mixed sort of DNA to be showing up, but plenty of Canaanite DNA should be showing up there. On the, what, the
Well, no, I'm
second
just
thing.
as we're,
Mhm,
because it is close to 1:15 and I want to make sure we're kind of ending close to on time.
mhm.
A lot of people are asking, are there sources? So what I would like to say is that you and I will confer after and I'll add a list of, somebody's like, is there a syllabus? Is there a bibliography? And
Oh,
I
sure.
know
Yes,
you
yes,
for
I
sure
can.
have all of this. I'll
Yeah,
create
I can send. That's ready. I'll send it to you, Ellie, and you can email it out to
we'll
a whole
share
list
it
later.
with
Yeah.
everyone because I know there are so many different. This is such a deep, rich topic, and we are just scratching the surface here. As we're kind of finishing up, is there any kind of in this moment where you think archaeology is fraught? All of this stuff is deeply politicized. How do you what as we're closing, what would you want to end with in this kind of universe?
So I think that it is true that archaeology can be deeply politicized, but that claim can be a very convenient way for people to dismiss evidence that they don't like. And I think that that's very, very dangerous. That's precisely why I didn't want to talk about what might have motivated some, but not all, of the minimalists at the beginning of the lecture. I often see this happening, that people dismiss, oh, this person thought such and such, that's why he discovered this. But in archaeology, there actually is data. And other people can come and check the data. And sometimes it does happen that other scholars come along and have a different interpretation of that data. But the tendency on various sides of people sort of to dismiss any archaeological evidence that they don't like by claiming that there's a political motive behind it, I think is intellectually lazy and intellectually dishonest. Number one. And I guess I would say just we shouldn't latch on to archaeological data or dismiss it because it does or does not conform to our hopes and our politics. By the way, when one looks at some of those claims of politicization, I don't think that they really follow so clearly. I've heard people say that, the great biblical archaeologist, the great American biblical scholar and archaeologist, William Foxwell Albright, well, he had this conservative agenda and he was a Christian Zionist, and that's why he found what he found. But it's actually much, much more complicated than that. He wasn't an evangelical Christian. He wasn't a right-wing Christian Zionist in the contemporary sense. Politically, he actually was in favor of a Jewish Palestinian confederation, along with people like Martin Buber, Judah Magnus, the president of Hebrew University. He was a supporter of that Brit Shalom group in the 1940s. The truth is that, like, by contemporary standards, he's an extremely, extremely, extremely left-wing Zionist. So the idea that, like, Albright's finds reflect, his ideological proclivities, I don't think that that's necessarily true. I could go through lots and lots of other examples of that. In particular, with Israeli archaeologists, I think some people on the European and American far left will say, oh, they're all Zionists. Politically, they tend to be quite left-wing, as a matter of fact, like professors in many places. So I would just urge people to avoid that kind of intellectual laziness, and I'd say that it's important to look at evidence. I think it's also important, though, to remember two things about archaeology. One, this is true in other areas, but it's especially true in archaeology. Absence of evidence is not evidence. The fact that you haven't found X doesn't prove that X never happened. You mentioned stuff about David. Well, actually, I'll come back to the David example in a second. Number two, archaeologists work with hard evidence. I mean, literally hard evidence, like it's rock, it's made of stone. But that evidence has to be interpreted. And it can often be interpreted more than one way by intellectually honest, responsible, well-trained archaeologists. I've never done a dig, but I've often gone into the field with archaeologists, and I'm looking around and all I see is a field and some stones. And then the archaeologist starts interpreting for me. And he says, look at those stones, that's all in a straight line. If you put all those ones together, and then there's a right angle. That doesn't happen in nature. And then I realized what I thought was a bunch of stones that were randomly spread around a field. The archaeologist he interprets it quite plausibly. I mean, again, I've done this. This has literally happened to me. And I all of a sudden see it in a different way. Oh, this is the outline of a house. I didn't realize that without that interpretation. Now, that's a case where I think everyone would agree, yeah, this is a house. But there are lots of other cases where the same hard evidence might be interpreted in somewhat different ways that leads in very, very different directions. A famous case involves a debate about certain fortifications that most archaeologists up until the 1990s dated to the time of Solomon. The Bible talks about Solomon bureaucratizing, rationalizing his state. Part of that involved putting fortifications in certain important areas. In 3 of the places that's described, there have been fortifications found that use the same blueprints. When you've got the same blueprint being used in a fort, let's say, in South Korea, in Virginia, and I don't know, where else are there American soldiers, in Iraq, and it's the exact same materials and the same plan, that's not a coincidence. That's because somewhere at the Pentagon, there's a guy that has the blueprints, and that's the blueprint that they use. That's what is happening in these particular fortifications. One group of scholars thought these fortifications, based on stratigraphy, are dated to about the 10th, the 9th century BCE. These are the Solomonic fortifications. This is really good evidence of a united monarchy founded by Solomon's father. Israel Finkelstein, very important archaeologist at Tel Aviv University, he's the one who did a lot of that work on pork bones and on the proto-Israelites settling in the highlands of Canaan at the very beginning of the Iron Age. Finkelstein says, no, all these fortifications are from a century later than everybody has said. And if that's the case, then the development of an Israelite monarchy, of a strong Israelite state, may be a century later than everybody thought it was. And it may be the case then that the biblical stories about a united monarchy are more of a retrojection into the past, in the same way that, that a person telling a story about the 1770s might describe America in the 1770s as being very much like our America. That's what the biblical authors were doing. And therefore, they're locating the origin of the Israelite polity as an organized state earlier than it really happened. So it's a big debate between different scholars. There's serious people, very well-trained people on both sides of the debate. I myself am not an archaeologist, so I don't really even have something to say in that debate. That's the case where, yeah, there is a real difference between 2 different scholarly schools who are looking at the same evidence. On the other hand, but you can't just say there's no evidence that a house of David ever existed or that a David ever existed. There's a lot of evidence pointing in that direction, but if you date the stratigraphy a little bit differently, that evidence doesn't go away, but it doesn't point to a David who already ruled over a united monarchy already in the year, let's say, 1000 BCE. It might be a century later before we're getting that kind of development. We clearly see in the 9th century that the Aramaeans knew about a Davidic dynasty. The Tel Dan inscription from the mid-9th century refers specifically to the Davidic dynasty. The fact that Aramaeans in the 9th century knew about a Davidic dynasty suggests it's probable that that dynasty had existed already a century earlier, but it doesn't prove it.
It's endless. It's like an endless, and I think that's the challenge here, that we're always dealing with in this realm of there's always more to know. So we just got a comment. This is a fascinating topic and an excellent presenter. Would love to see a follow-up session. So keep your email posted. I'm gonna cut this off for today, with the hope that maybe we can continue this conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Sommer. This was really a pleasure. You always provide so many interesting sources and so many different ways of looking at things. I want to thank Yale again. Oh, we have people actually clapping in the, I hope you see the video of the people clapping. I want to thank Yale Asbel, our generous sponsor, for his sponsorship today. And then I also want to just give a quick plug for next week. Rabbi Gordon Tucker, who's the Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement, is going to be sharing his takeaways from the recent convening. And Gordon's always a pleasure, and we're excited to hear from him. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And have a great rest of your day, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thanks very much. Thank you all. And thank you again, Yael. Bye-bye.